So it's nice to see everyone today. My name is Matt Bristow-Smith. I am a career educator from the small but mighty Edgecombe County Public Schools, home of Dr. Valerie H. Bridges, our State Superintendent of the Year. Whoop, whoop, whoop. You're allowed as policymakers and leaders to go whoop, whoop, whoop. Totally okay. I don't think the live stream is on you. So, thank you. I'm at SAS, right? You have to break the ice a little bit, right? So, I have spent my entire career in Edgecombe County. 16 years as a teacher, 8 years as a principal, twice as much time in the classroom as in the principal role. And I want to center our work today around something that I think you guys all truly believe, but I think it's also worth just saying out loud. And that is that great teachers make all the difference. My wife's a teacher. My mom is a teacher. My daughter is graduating this year and heading off to college to become a teacher. And growing up, everyone I ever really respected in some way or other, whether they were in a classroom or not, was a teacher. My grandparents, Ms. Norman, my kindergarten teacher, at every step of the way I have grown up, surrounded by people who implicitly or explicitly taught me how to become Matt. And looking back on it, one of the things I realized is that I don't think I have ever had a bad teacher, an unqualified teacher, a teacher who didn't push me to be a better version of myself. I don't think growing up I ever had a long-term sub like my daughter did last year for her history class the entire year. Not a teacher in that classroom the entire year. I have been incredibly fortunate. Never a hiccup, never a holding pattern, always baby steps or giant strides forward along the way. And I've always known that great teachers make all the difference. When I was in high school searching for my career of choice, I was sitting in Rob Slater's English class at East Forsyth High School, and in this middle of like this angst of the moment, like what am I going to do with my whole future, I had this amazing teacher in front of me, Rob Slater, and a little light bulb went off and said, I want to do what he does. What I really meant was I want to make the impact that he does. When I became a teacher at Tarboro High School, and for 16 years, every day I walked in knowing, carrying that responsibility. I know great teachers make all the difference, and I'm a teacher, and therefore it's up to me to make the difference. And now as a principal, 8 years as a principal, the commitment I try to make to our parents is that when you send a child to our school, we're going to make sure that one way or another, he or she or they will have a great teacher in their classroom from the moment they walk in as freshmen to the moment that they graduate from us, and that there won't be a gap along the way, even if the principal has to step in and teach class himself. We're not going to have a gap in instruction because great teachers make all the difference. And you know that, and I know that, but we need to center our work collectively around that it is all about the impact that teachers make. Period. Funding matters, curriculum matters, standards matter, pedagogy matters, principles matter. But from the perspective of student achievement and student growth, great teachers make all the difference, period. And that's why today I'm really excited to introduce to you guys Dr. Matthew Springer. Matthew Springer started out as a teacher and a principal working in New York, teaching psychology, sociology, environmental ethics. Dr. Springer got his PhD and has done a lot of his research and work around the idea of accountability and incentives in K-16 education, keeping his focus on the fact that great teachers make all the difference for children. He joined the faculty and the Peabody College of Education at Vanderbilt and continued his research there and work, and now he's at UNC Chapel Hill, and today he's going to bring you a message about the impact of great teachers. And so with that, I'd like to invite Dr. Matthew Springer to join us today. Thank you.
Well, good morning. That was better than you guys gave Brenda. I'll take it. To start off with, I do want to express my appreciation to Walter, to Brenda, to Leah for having me out today, as well as the NC Stride Commission, Tom Tomberlin, for extending the invite. I very much appreciate it. I should also recognize Chris Brooks. I see you, Chris, over there. Chris is an advanced PhD student at Carolina studying education policy. He's done a lot of work around the economic value of teacher effectiveness. He's examined different ways in which teacher evaluation can work and help pull together the slides today. So the caveat I always use is if you have any complaints about the slides today, the information I'm conveying, we can blame that on Chris. And finally, I do want to thank Matthew. I think Matthew up there as well for the wonderful introduction. But most importantly, I think we all should acknowledge that he does have one of the greatest first names in the business. To get started today, my talk is going to loosely address 4 areas under the general umbrella of improving educational opportunity within the state of North Carolina. I'll provide a quick primer overview of resource allocation and deployment decisions. I'll talk about the importance of teacher quality in substantive context. So what does it actually mean within practice? I'm going to talk about strategic compensation reform and some of my research around it, really highlighting how it holds promise despite what we hear from pundits in the popular media. And then finally, I'm also going to address one final piece, which is access to highly effective instruction and how that access can vary based upon a student's background characteristics. However, prior to diving into these topics, I do want to offer what I call a quick primer. Anytime that you're given I think I have 25 minutes here to overview kind of a large body of research, I always think it's important that we set some foundation to other aspects that I don't touch upon, right? We need to be able to understand the nuance in which we're talking about. And first, teaching and learning is this complex multi-purpose enterprise. As Matt mentioned, I'm a product of a teacher education program. I taught sociology, psychology, and environmental ethics before heading back to academia. And it's critical that we emphasize the multiple processes and outcomes that education strives to achieve. I also think that anytime we're talking about reforms, particularly compensation reforms or human resource policies, particularly within the context of the pathways policy, we need to make sure that the supports are in place for teachers, right? We can think of supports for early career teachers, making sure that they have what they need to become successful. We also need to make sure that mentors have the resources, they have the training to be highly effective. And finally, we can think about school and district personnel are prepared to lead changes in personnel policies and practices. And these supports haven't always been in place in the training that teachers go through. And finally, just as location are the core tenets of the real estate market, implementation are truly the core tenets of education reform. I was speaking with a good colleague of mine, Diana Lease, who runs our educator prep program at Carolina, and she had this great analogy for this very example. I'm going to give her credit this time. I'll probably steal it as mine because it's that good moving forward. But she said education reform we can compare it to brushing our teeth. Now, stay with me on this one, right? At first, I was a little skeptical too. But education reform has taken the approach that you take one giant squirt of toothpaste, you brush your teeth once, and you're set for the year, versus taking a much more integrated approach whereby where we use a little toothpaste, we brush our teeth twice a day, and we continue to work on it as it evolves over time. Now, you guys have listened to a bunch of people present and talk so far this morning, so these are designed as a basic way to engage very quickly with some audience participation. So what I'd like to ask everyone is, how much money did the United States spend on K-12 public education during the 2018-19 school year, the most recent year in which we have federal data? And here we're talking about total expenditures, and these are adjusted to current dollars. So I'll ask, is it A, B, C, or D? And the way we're going to do audience participation is on the count of 3, you're going to say A, B, C, or D. You guys are laughing. This is good. A, B, C. All right. 1, 2, 3. You are all wrong. It is actually D. Yes, I saw somebody that said D over there. Perfect. We spent just shy of $800 billion. Now, let's see if we can transfer this into per pupil terms. So again, how much did the United States spend during the 2018-19 school year, adjusted into current dollars, on a per pupil basis? Again, we're going to follow the same format. 1, 2, 3. Okay, you're all wrong. You've been trained to not have open-ended responses. It's actually 15,621. Now, I also think it's critical that we begin to think about how these resources are actually allocated. And what you see here is a breakdown of summary of current expenditures. Now, we're talking total expenditures minus debt services. And I want to highlight what's in red. And what's in red is showing that approximately 80% of all of the district's operational expenditures go to salaries and employee benefits. Now, let's lock that away. We're going to come back to it through a couple examples here. And what I want to start now talking about is what I always call the one universal truth that we have in the K-12 public education system. And that universal truth is the importance of teacher quality. No matter whether you're sitting on the far right-hand side of the political aisle or the far left-hand side of the political aisle, I think most, if not everyone, can agree about the important role that teacher quality plays in the opportunity and the growth of its students. We have seen quotes like this, myself included: teachers are the single most important within school determinant of student achievement. I also think it's quite fitting that we set this within research that occurred in 1997 by Bill Sanders. We're here at the SAS Institute, and Bill was very much a pioneer of value-added measures of teacher effectiveness. Further research has shown that it further quantifies teacher effects by showing that a high-performing teacher can produce 3 times the achievement growth compared to a low-performing teacher in a single year. That's half a year's worth of growth compared to 1.5 years' worth of academic growth. Another study shows that if a student comes into contact with successive years of a highly performing teacher, can overcome what we typically describe as the socioeconomic achievement gap. More recent research has begun to quantify this in terms of long-term benefits in terms of a range of outcomes, including high school graduation, college attendance, higher earnings, and better outcomes. One study uses a value-added measure of teacher effectiveness to show that it increases these outcomes. Another study has used a composite measure of teacher effectiveness and to show that these high-performing teachers have significant impact on high school graduation and college attendance. Research has also begun to operationalize what is the economic value here. And they've taken this work and shown that assuming a teacher has a class size of 20 students in a single year, that teacher is 1 standard deviation above the median, they're expected to increase lifetime earnings for their students by $780,000. Now, I also mentioned that this education is this multi-product, multi-purpose enterprise, and there is work that's being developed around non-test score measures of teacher value added that are also associated with significant decreases in dropout rates, increases in graduation rates, total GPA, SAT uptake, and college-going intentions. Now, I think it's really important that we set this within the context of what is happening within North Carolina. To illustrate this, I first standardized student, and I should actually say Chris first standardized student math test scores in grades 3, 4, and 5, so that scores had a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1. We then selected a subset of students that scored in the middle quintile. That's in the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th quintile of the test score distribution. We're eliminating students with low scores and students with very high scores. Then we plotted and said, what would the test score gains look like? What do the test score gains look like for these students who are then exposed to 2 successive years of a highly effective teacher? And what do those test score gains look like for a student who is exposed to 2 successive years of a low value-added teacher? And interestingly, when we subset this data, as you'll see in the orange and blue dots up here, both the groups that we're looking at started at a very similar point. They're about 0.1 standard deviations above average, which equates to around the 55th percentile of the achievement distribution. And this is what we see. When those students go from 4th grade to 5th grade, are exposed to a highly effective teacher, they end 5th grade by scoring around 465 on the end of grade math score, which is equivalent to moving the teacher, it's 0.4 standard deviations above average, which is equivalent to moving the teacher, or moving the student from the 55th percentile to the 68th percentile in 2 years. Now, what does it look like if that student entered 2 years of a low-performing teacher's classroom? They go from 0.1 standard deviations above average to 0.1 standard deviations below average, ending with a score of around 465. That's equivalent for moving that student from the 55th percentile in 3rd grade to the 45th percentile in 5th grade. Now, let's piece some of this information together, and let's discuss it within the context of, I would say, I call this a fun thought experiment, and so I hope folks enjoy it. Let's set what it would look like to have an entrepreneurial pitch of education within the context of Shark Tank, right? I see some people nodding. Some people like Shark Tank. For those who are unfamiliar with it, it is a wonderful option if you run out of options on Netflix or Hulu. It is an easy show that you can binge over and over. And what the setup is you have these 5 sharks, these 5 investors, and a set of entrepreneurs or inventors who want to pitch a product come in front of these sharks, and they pitch their ideas in a few short minutes. They ask a series of questions about the product that they want to pitch, and then they decide whether they're going to form a partnership or whether they're going to invest in that particular business. Lori Greiner's on it, Mark Cuban, Damon John. It's quite fun to watch. Some of my favorite, does anybody own Bombas socks? Oh, yes, good. Some people, yeah, perfect. So Bombas socks are one of my favorites from the show. They're re-engineered athletic socks. It's a socially responsible company. For every sock sold, they donate a pair of socks. In 2018, I looked this up this morning, they had more than $100 million in revenue. And since the time it launched in 2013, they've donated over 45 million pairs of socks. I don't own Bombas socks, but I do own a Scrub Daddy. It is underneath my sink. That did come through Shark Tank as well. And then I think importantly, too, we must acknowledge the comfy. And in particular, who would not want a comfy in Carolina blue? I will also say I saw those same colors in the dress that Brenda showed us earlier. Now, what does this pitch actually sound like? Imagine for the moment that there is no such thing as public education, and you're set to pitch your idea. You're likely asking yourself things like, what might your pitch sound like? What types of questions will the sharks ask? Will I ultimately be successful in my pitch? Let's find out. I'm going to guess there's little doubt that your presentation starts off promisingly strong. You can guarantee that more than 50 million students will enroll annually, and that state governments are going to compel those students between ages of 5 and 19, depending upon what state, that they must attend public education, after which time they're no longer legally obligated. State governments are also going to limit the amount of competition that you face. You have a virtual monopoly. Enthusiasm grows over your pitch as you explain your financial model. Your revenue stream is going to be based on a set of local and state taxes, along with a supplement around 9% from the federal government. And that will make up a total around $800 billion per year, or about $15,500 per student. You also explain that you plan to invest in educators, with approximately 80% of your current expenditures being allocated to teacher salaries and employee benefits. You plan this investment because you know the secret sauce. Secret sauce is entrepreneurial language for that chief factor, that one thing that is going to promote success. That secret sauce is educators. You review for the judges more than 2 decades of academic research that clearly shows teachers are the single most important within-school determinant of student learning. You're also very transparent, noting these effects can vary considerably across teachers, even within the same school. Your pitch of public education has clearly impressed the sharks, but your presentation begins to shift to a series of hard-hitting questions. In particular, how do you plan to compensate the 3.8 million educators that you plan to hire to deliver this thing you call public education? The sharks start firing questions at you. How do you reward and recognize high-performing teachers? Do you differentiate pay by the location of the school? Do you pay math, science, special education teachers differently than other fields that have greater supply than areas such as elementary education? What mechanisms are in place to ensure student access to highly effective teachers is not a result of the zip code or neighborhood in which they live? You explain to the judges that you do not plan to differentiate pay. You explain the need for pay equality, that you plan to compensate teachers based upon a series of steps and lanes defined by years of experience and level of schooling that a teacher has completed. The judges seem a bit perplexed. They ask a somewhat rhetorical question. Clearly, years of experience and degree held must have a very strong influence on the outcomes you're trying to produce. You explain to the Sharks that understanding which teacher characteristics produce student outcomes has been elusive to you in many instances. One study shows that teacher characteristics that can measure things such as experience or education level or credentials only explains around 3% of the variation in student achievement. As you try to clarify this, because there is nuance, as I started with, that knowing additional years of experience can have a meaningful, can predict teacher effectiveness. A master's degree in the field of study, select educator pathways do have some predictive power. They say, so you're telling me that even though you know teachers are the single most important within school determinant of student learning, and you plan to spend somewhere between 60 and 80% of your operational expenditures on teachers and salaries, the way in which you plan to compensate those teachers has very little, if not nothing, to do with the outcomes you're trying to produce. For anyone who's watched the show, you can imagine that in unison, the Sharks state, I'm out. Now, on the other side of this argument, we have to also ask ourselves, is there a better way? If we turn to popular media and we turn to pundits, differentiated or strategic compensation plans don't sound very promising. Forbes says teacher merit pay doesn't work. Edweek says teachers need more pay, not merit pay. I agree teachers need more pay. I also agree that our highest performing teachers need a six-figure salary. One of the most recent ones that I ran across also was a recent thought piece that called merit pay the zombie policy, because it's failed again and again and has been conclusively discredited. In light of this, I do want to shift the presentation to provide actually a research-based perspective on these statements. In Cliff Notes, apologies to my outstanding high school English teachers, Mr. Patterson, Mr. Brown, I can name them. I remember them some 30 years later. But strategic compensation has a meaningful positive effect on test scores. Retention incentives can fundamentally alter what I'll say are gross inequalities that exist within educational opportunity. Also, it's critically important that well-designed and emphasized implemented strategic compensation systems hold a tremendous potential. Let me explain a little bit more. So in 2018, with colleagues Lam Pham, Lam is now at NC State as an assistant professor, another good colleague, Tuan Nguyen, who's at Kansas State now, we conducted a meta-analysis of the teacher merit pay literature, the teacher incentive pay literature. For those who are unfamiliar with merit pay, or excuse me, those who are unfamiliar with meta-analyses, it's a research approach that allows us to systematically pull together and synthesize an evidence of a body of research. Right? So instead of citing individual studies, we can cite what the overall body of work shows us. And so we focused on examining what is the impact of these differentiated compensation plans on student test scores. We started by developing a search string, running it through search engines like JSTOR, ProQuest, EconLit, ERIC, Google Scholar. It produced for us, and we're focused on literature between January 1989 to January 2018. And we ultimately identified 20,000 possibilities for review. We read the titles, the abstracts, the introductions of these 20,000 entries, and rounding it down to 137 articles for full review to see if they meet the criteria for inclusion in the study. Ultimately, we ended up with 37 studies that met all criteria. Things that were dropped from that initial 137 was if the study actually did not evaluate a merit pay program, if it did not examine the impact of test scores, if it didn't have a comparison group. 37 teacher merit pay studies, 26 of which were conducted in the United States. We then coded and reported effect sizes across these 37 studies. What you see here, and I'm sorry the slide's very small, but you see a black vertical line. That's the 0, meaning that there was no increase or decrease in test scores. For each study that we reviewed, we plot the average effect size, which is the black diamond. We also show what we call confidence intervals, and that's the plausible range that we might expect those estimates to fall. We found that the presence of merit pay was associated with a 0.043 standard deviation increase in test scores in the United States, roughly equivalent to 3.5 additional weeks of learning. The effect was larger in math than it was in reading, but statistically significant in both instances. The effect more than doubled if merit pay had a professional development opportunity for teachers. Other program characteristics, such as the size of bonuses, were critically important. We also tried to examine as well what the impact was on the labor market. Unfortunately, there weren't enough studies for a formal meta-analysis, so we just did a simple vote count and concluded that there was suggestive evidence showing that incentive pay policies can help with the retention of educators. And to illustrate this, I want to talk about some work that I've done with a couple of my former students, Luis Rodriguez, who's at New York University now, as well as Walker Swain, who's down at the University of Georgia. And I think it does a really nice job of highlighting the importance that retention incentives can play, particularly as we think about providing high-quality educational opportunities. In the spring of 2013, then Governor Bill Haslam approved the Tennessee Governor's Retention Incentive Program. It was in response to the fact that highly effective teachers were exiting high-priority schools at about 5 times the rate of which the highly effective teachers were exiting the average school within the state. The proposed solution was simple. We're going to offer a $5,000 retention bonus to these highly effective teachers defined as a level 5 teacher on a composite measure of teacher effectiveness. In high-priority schools, in this context, was defined as schools in the bottom 5% according to an accountability metric. And what we found as a result of this was that the retention bonus increased the predicted probability of retention by 20%. And this is really large if we put it in the context that if we see a distribution here, the average teacher in Tennessee is at the mean. The average level 5 teacher that was retained in the priority school was around the 84th percentile of teacher effectiveness. The average teacher that filled the position when a level 5 teacher left the school was at approximately the that line, it got shifted too close to the mean, was around the 24th percentile of the teacher effectiveness distribution. Now, I want to note that teachers do have transition costs when they're moving into schools, and that might impact the measure of effectiveness. There's other considerations that I fully want to acknowledge and be aware of that we also take into account, such as years of experience. So I have about 3 minutes left here. We then did a follow-up study where we said, okay, when the data became available, what was the impact on student learning within these schools? And we found large impacts, of what I'll describe as large impacts on reading and math test scores, somewhere between what I'd say are 4.5 and 11.5 weeks of learning. Again, some of these conversions of converting effect sizes to weeks of learning, there's discussion about whether that's the best conversion, but I think it does a nice job highlighting the important role that these types of systems can put in place. The other piece I want to highlight real quickly is just turn attention to access to highly effective instruction as well. Using Tennessee data from 2007 to 2015 with some colleagues, we found that students eligible for free and reduced price lunch on average were 44% less likely to be assigned to a highly effective teacher in the same school and the same grade. We see similar patterns when we do this with a charter school network with 837 teachers nested in 78 schools. We found that non-white students were significantly less likely to be assigned to a high value-added teacher within the same school and within the same grade. We're currently documenting these patterns within North Carolina. We hope to have the paper out in the next month or two, as well as some research briefs around it. But I also want to acknowledge that in addition to documenting these patterns, we're working on a scalable technology that's going to leverage historical data on teachers and students to assign them to classrooms in order to prevent those inequities from happening. And I want to thank the Belk Foundation in particular for providing financial support for this work, as well as a large urban district that we are working with to pilot this study. And again, I come back to this notion that we need to provide high-quality educational opportunity to all students. So in terms of closing thoughts, I can go a number of ways, right? The first is that I think we all can agree exposure to highly effective instruction can positively impact short, medium, and long-run outcomes. Despite what I describe as popular media, despite what I describe as pundits' positions, strategic compensation can have a meaningful positive effect on student test scores. It can fundamentally alter educational opportunity for children, particularly children in some of our most underserved school settings, and it can be an effective pathway for rewarding and recognizing our best educators. In terms of closing thoughts here, real quickly, in terms of what I think in the perspective of the Pathways proposal. North Carolina needs to invest in what works, both in terms of its current practices and future opportunities. I want to highlight some work by Michael Mayer and Jenny Korn at DPI, who've partnered with the NC Policy Collaboratory to fund up to $6 million in research grants through a strategic partnership to better understand reforms and innovations that are being put in place, to better understand learning loss as it relates to the CARES and ESSER 3 funding. North Carolina has also had this long history with data and research and needs to keep this culture alive. Research in practices and innovations with North Carolina for decades influenced the national conversation. That has slowed in recent years. We need to keep asking, how do we get better at getting better? And then the final piece here, too, is back to implementation, right? No matter if we pull together the best set of ideas, if we do not implement them properly, if we do not study them, if we do not learn from variation and implementation across sites, the effects that we intend to achieve won't be realized. Thank you.